Welcome to Objection to the Forum. This is Justin Humphreys. This week I've got two guests, so we're doing a little bit differently. We've got Will Oden and Hank Harris with Ward & Smith. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm interested in a new project you guys are doing that I think Will's told me a little bit about, where I believe you guys are getting into the consulting business.
That's right. So about 3 years ago, during a strategic planning session at the law firm, we were spitballing ideas, and it just became very obvious there were things we could do for our clients that we weren't currently doing because lawyers don't do it. And so the idea was at some point down the road we would start a business consultancy if we found the right person to help run it.
And how is what you're doing as a business consultant different from what you would do for a business person or entrepreneur that comes to you for legal advice about their business?
It's probably better suited for you to answer that.
Yeah, well, there can be a little bit of overlap in some areas, but I'd say for the most part, legal work is, legal work. It's helping clients, solve a legal problem, look at a statute, look at legal contracts, whatever the issue might be. Business consulting really has not much to do with that. It's a whole different world of helping businesses with their strategy and how they're going to structure themselves and, how they may handle their people. How are they as managers? How are they as leaders? How do they get better? It's a whole different agenda.
Are you dealing primarily with startup organizations, or are you working with businesses in all different phases?
I'd say we're dealing more with mature businesses than startups for a variety of reasons. And most of the clients are for the most part, companies that Ward & Smith's got a relationship with pre-existing, from the legal side, and historically would have just referred business like this out, and this is a way to diversify and capture some of that same business that they normally would have referred elsewhere.
So you were mentioning things like how a company is structured is kind of one of the issues that you would be involved in. I imagine that's a situation where you could kind of work together with legal, where if you're talking about just if it's a raising capital situation, or if it's the corporate governance structure or things of that nature, that I guess those could be areas where you could kind of work together with legal.
Yeah, there could be definitely, and there is some synergy, in the things. And one of the things we may talk about here, for example, is planning for succession of a business. And no matter what happens, there's going to be legal work ultimately to get that done. To button it up, whatever the agreements might be. So there's certain work that may take place in consulting, to affect the company. Could be structure, could be something they're trying to make happen strategically. It could be a lot of things, but ultimately it may take legal work to actually get the ball over the goal line, if that makes sense.
I'm glad you brought up succession planning, because that's an issue that we see cause problems in a lot of closely held businesses and family businesses. And I'm wondering, from a consulting perspective, do you think it tends to make sense to deal with succession planning through kind of an estate perspective, or do you advise people to handle it in their corporate governing documents, or what do you think are effective strategies to deal with succession planning?
That's a great question, and I've been thinking a lot about this lately, just because I've spent a bunch of time talking to Ward & Smith's estate and business lawyers about what they do and trying to make sure that we are doing something synergistic and so forth. But I would say that the world I came from, when we dealt with that, they tended to be, even though they were private businesses, they tended to be somewhat large, and sometimes they would have complex family dynamics and potential family ownership, or a blend of family and employees. You can see the same thing with a smaller business, but where we came in was let's say the patriarch, or maybe the founding generation, really would struggle to understand what they wanted to do, and so they really couldn't sit down with their lawyers and accountants and say, do this, get son A, get daughter B, get here's what we want you to do. They run in circles. And so our job was to come up with a game plan, and then let the professional attorneys and accountants take over and do what they would normally do. There are plenty of owners that know exactly what they'd like to do, and if they do, or if they're close, they don't need a guy like me. They can go right to their lawyers and accountants and get it done. We're only good in the situations where it's kind of a mess and people are having a hard time understanding what the possibilities might be or what path they might go down. And there's some owners, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, family or employees or whatever. It also could be the owner who's just struggling with, would my company be a good ESOP company? Would my company be attractive to private equity? Is there some other way to get out?
So you're a little bit over my head right now. So
Yeah.
you say ESOP. What do you mean by that?
Well, those are employee stock ownership plans, which have become more popular in the last 30 years or so. And but they're not good for every company. I mean, they're a very tax advantaged way for an owner to get out by selling it to his employees. And if it wasn't for the tax advantages, frankly, nobody would ever do it. But if you think about, do I sell my company and I'm going to get a certain amount of money out of doing that, and then I'm going to be gone, or I could do a partial ESOP or a full ESOP, still be around for part of it, maintain control up to a certain point, and still get some of the tax advantages. And for a lot of owners, there's there are really two sides, I think, for most owners, which is there's an emotional component, and this is my baby. It's like a child. I mean, I've run this business, I've had it for most of my adult life, and so it's a very emotional thing. But there's also what avenue is going to allow you to take the most after-tax dollars away when it's all over with. And so that's an analysis of all these different options that they may have. And for some businesses, they're small, they're erratic performers, whatever the reason might be, their options are going to be limited because they won't be attractive to private equity. They won't fit the ESOP model and so forth.
What do you tend to observe that private equity is looking for, and if they're looking to purchase a closely held business?
Private equity is almost funny these days. It really has gotten so rampant out there. They're actually selling companies to each other, which should make us all wonder what's really going on. But ultimately, the theory of private equity is you're going to buy a business. You're probably going to do it with a lot of bank debt, and then you're going to look at that business and say, we are so good at what we do that we're going to not only service the bank debt, we're going to improve the value of that business in 5 years and sell it and make a killing. That's the theory, and with everybody that gets on board. And in the old days, it actually worked pretty well because there wasn't that much of it going on, and the deal flow was such that you could really be very careful about what you decided to focus on. And the theory of all that is still the same, but it's much more competitive to find the deals that fit. Having said all, they all look for pretty similar stuff, which is recurring revenue stream. They love service businesses. They love things where there's accounts. They hate businesses where you have to reinvent the business all the time. Like a construction contractor, which I don't always, you have these projects, they're done. You got to go get more. So they want recurring revenue. They want pre-tax profits that typically are going to be 7-8%, maybe north of that. They don't want a lot of encumbrances with things like bonds and banks and stuff like that. Sort of a clean business with a lot of assurance that the revenue will always be coming in.
Yeah. It is. During quarantine and whatnot, I spent a good amount of time watching Succession.
Yeah,
I don't know if you've seen. I love that show. And so I certainly can see where it gets a little bit hairy. And just in a lot of the legal disputes that we end up dealing with, sometimes you look at it and say, well, it's kind of an ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure. But you do see those type of situations where it's just poor planning or lack of foresight, or just a lot of times the family dynamics, like you're bringing up. Do you find that there's a certain niche that you're working with of like a kind of a commonly recurring type of business that you're consulting for, or is it just kind of all across the spectrum?
It can be all across the spectrum, and certainly the market that we have with the legal base, client base of Ward Smith, I think runs the gamut. But there is, I think, a fair amount of family business, and in the world I came from, which was I served mostly big construction engineering companies, and there was, I want to say all family, but 90% had even big ones. I mean, I had multi-billion-dollar companies that were owned by families. So it was very much typical in my old life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It how do you balance some of the difficulties with kind of, you mentioned the very large, closely held companies. Do you tend to give them more, is it more of a marketing end, or aside from the succession planning, are you looking at compliance and those types of issues?
Yeah, well, why don't you talk about that from
Yeah.
HR?
So we certainly can go in and help with their strategic planning if they've not really thought long term and they're more focused on the day, right? I mean, one of the value of a consultant is you show up and you're in the room, and so they have to pay attention. They have to do something because you're there. From the human resources perspective, we represent companies that don't have necessarily a full-time HR director and need some back office HR support. As part of my background, I went ahead and got all the SHRM and SPHR certifications and everything earlier in my legal career, and I've always worked a lot with HR directors, and I really enjoy it. And so that was just an idea that came from that. In addition to that, Hank's, I think, very good at leadership development, and so he's certainly helping me in terms of a business that needs someone to be a consigliere to the younger generation coming up that needs maybe some polish or some additional mentorship. Hank can do that. What else would you say?
Yeah. No, I think that's a good overview.
Are there common mistakes or areas that you typically notice that where maybe younger leaders or kind of beginning business owners tend to make that are kind of routine areas where you work with people?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I would say that a lot of younger, not just young, but people that haven't, or they're coming into management, they usually come from the technical or operational side of their business. Not always the case, but I'd say 80% of the time. You may occasionally get somebody that comes from accounting or the get work side or whatever, but most of them tend to come from the core, and they're groomed up through the business. So when they get out there, they know the business pretty well, and they're probably pretty good managers, or they wouldn't have come up the ranks. So I think where they need the most help is understanding that now that they're at the top, it's not really about managing as much as it is about leading people. It's and the agenda shifts. And obviously that can be somewhat size dependent, so it's a general statement.
And I think that's a really interesting concept. So how would you contrast management versus leadership for somebody that's looking to grow their business, or just from a conceptual level?
Yeah, well, the way we used to do it was we would say, the textbook definition of management is plan, organize, and control. That's right out of Management 101, right? But if you think about what does it mean to lead people, and it's to set direction and to align them and to motivate them. So we put acronyms on that. We'd say POC, SAM, and so the leadership acronym, is, if you think about that, it's a much softer skill set, right? It's really more of a political, social job, and you don't meet too many. If you look at like CEOs of large companies who are good, you don't meet too many of them don't have some pretty refined social skills, because it's all a social job. It's all about getting things done through other people. When you manage, you're still close to the fire, and you may have to roll up your sleeves and punch out some widgets yourself, but probably not once you're the CEO.
Do you find that as much in the small private, like the closely held business scenario, as much as your publicly traded company type CEO?
Probably not. I mean, it's probably, but I'd say once a business has got any kind of size to it, unless for talking purposes, let's say it's got 100 people or 10 million in revenue or some number, but it gets big enough to where you got enough people to where it's complicated. It's not just, and everybody's looking to you because, the way human organizations work, including our country, is, we look to the messages coming down from the top. And even if you don't like the bosses, you still take your signals from them, which is kind of funny. But it's just the way we all are. And so I think that being a good leader is knowing that, you're not going to do the work yourself. You're trying to get everybody else to do the right stuff, whatever the right stuff is.
One of the ways that I've kind of thought of in terms of measuring the effectiveness of a leader or a manager is the productivity of a business that has multiple locations. And the reason why I say that is because ultimately you can control what happens within the walls where you're located if you're a manager, I guess, so to speak. So and depending on how organized you may be, you can answer all the questions or you can put out all the fires. But it seems like to me a lot of times the better leaders or the more effective managers that are handling multiple locations at one time have really put the foresight into systems and have really thought through the processes and the issues and really kind of build a business. It's not them having to issue orders and edicts and have to physically be present in order to make the business work.
Well, I think that's a great observation. And you think of the larger a company gets, the less tactile it is for the leader to be able to reach out and say, you do this now, right? So you have to set those systems. And culture is kind of a squishy word for people, but I would argue that the bigger an organization is, the more the culture actually matters, because you can't control it all. And so, everybody out there, I call them moments of truth. Like let's say you're working in Dairy Queen and it's supposed to shut down at 9 o'clock, and somebody orders a hamburger at 8:58, right? But you don't want to cook that burger and stay, So what's the employee going to do at that moment of truth? Or you got an angry employee returning a whip or something, or whatever it might be. The employees, they have those discretionary moments, and you can't stamp them all out, even with the thickest rule book. So the culture really is critical, I think, in how people make those decisions.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned culture, and it seems to be another common component of businesses that are successful. And what I'm wondering is, so let's say you're doing evaluation for a company and you come to the conclusion that this company has a culture problem. Can you change the culture and leave the staff and leadership structure in place? Because it seems like to me sometimes, bad culture can be created as a result of sustained bad habits, or sometimes it's attitudes of the leaders, or there's a lot of different components that can cause it. But sometimes, once the culture, do you think the culture ever gets a point where it's baked in with the people that are present in the company, or do you think it's possible for an organization to change its culture but keep the staff intact and the leadership structure intact?
Yes and no.
Okay, so now I'm lost myself. So
yes, it can get baked in.
Yes.
Okay,
and it's almost impossible to change it without some changing up of the guard and the people. That's why you see, even sometimes we pick up the paper and see people that we like or think highly of, and they're good in one aspect, but they get shot out of the saddle because for whatever reason the organization's got to go in a different direction, and sometimes they're being shot out of the saddle for symbolic purposes,
and a lot of times you'll see that, and
Yeah.
a lot of times even in the sports context, you'll see somebody say, well, we needed a culture shift, or it's same thing can happen in business and organizations, but when you're the owner, let's say, of a business, or you may be the source of the culture problem. What do you do at that point? Where you come to the realization our culture's poor, but it's my company, so I don't want to. I don't want to sell it. What can you do at that point to start to turn things around?
That's a great question, and I've actually, I've seen that. I mean, one of the first things that has to happen, which can be, very difficult and maybe even close to, I'd say, rare, but the patriarch or whoever comes to that realization has to come to that realization. So how many of us are really good at looking in the mirror and saying, I don't like what I see? Yeah. That's a tough thing. But I've seen it happen, and generally speaking, if somebody's got that kind of enlightened view and what I might call enlightened self-interest, they can do some things. They can get outside board members to come around them. They can get somebody to be a COO, to be kind of make the trains run on time, wear the black hat, maybe relieve them from having to be the black hat. Or if they just can't stop being the black hat, have that person be the white hat, But there's all kinds of things they can do if they're enlightened enough to become aware of it. You know,
If you're building from the ground up, do you have any type of advice for how to avoid getting in that position to establishment of a positive, productive culture?
um, I think there's a couple things that jump to mind. My wife is fond of saying that we are all the product of the top 10 people we hang around. So one thing that I think business leaders and people running companies should do is hang around some positive, you know, people who can help them think through how they want to conduct themselves, how they want to comport themselves, what do they want to build in their company. I think all business leaders like that really need a network of, I'd almost call it a peer network, and there are lots of ways to get it, but it's really important because it is kind of lonely for them. You know, they face unique problems that they don't have a natural outlet of people to talk to. You know, I put a plug in for consultants because I spent my life in the consulting business, so that's a biased comment, but good consultants can make the difference, can make a big difference in in the right setting at the right time. You know, there are other things that I think associations offer some of that. If you compare a privately held business CEO with a publicly held business CEO, the amount of information that, and this has changed a little bit in today's world, but I would still say that there is an asymmetrical access to information in that comparison. Public company CEOs are flooded with outside input. They have systems, they have processes, they have budgets, you know, they can buy it. There are lots of ways. You know, you're running a small business and you're the CEO and you're the chief cook and bottle washer and you run out of time and the days go by. It's a lot harder, you know.
Well, I think that's really smart advice. And, you know, I remember about, I guess it's been, you know, coming up on 8 years ago when I left the firm that I was working for to kind of go into private practice. And I went from, you know, it was a smaller firm, but there was probably about 6 or 7 guys, maybe about 15 folks working at the office to me by myself in an executive suite. And it kind of concerned me because, you know, and Will probably tell you some of the most difficult or the attorneys we don't like working with are solo people that are just kind of, and not because, you know, big firms and small firms they all can do good work, but a lot of times the guy that's just by himself tends to, it's kind of some of what you're talking about. You don't have the feedback or you don't have the interaction, or sometimes it's just you just kind of turn into a hermit, or I don't know what it is. But and I was kind of concerned with that happening to me, because one of the things I enjoyed about my prior practice was being able to go ask a question or go kind of bounce ideas off of people, and I was worried that was going to happen to me going to my office by myself, you know, and so we were.
So life is an echo chamber.
Yes, yeah, because if you're asking yourself the question, sometimes, you know, garbage in, garbage out, I guess is what it can be.
Well, and I think, you know, it kind of ties back to your earlier question about people coming up the management ranks and developing themselves and all that. And I think, you know, if you look at these leadership development programs, leadership institutes, you know, stuff, we used to have one, and, you know, there's a famous one in Greensboro called the Center for Creative Leadership. I mean, but that, you know, leadership over the last 25 years or so is really elevated to be a major business topic. You know, I mean, it didn't used to be talked about in those terms, but it is now. And they take a lot of it from the military, actually. The military concepts weigh heavily on what's been woven into, you know, business. But if you look at those development programs, they're mostly about you learning about yourself. So, you know, they take people who may not have been through a lot of it before and put them through a battery of instruments, you know, sort of psychological stripped down type, you know, who are you really? And then a lot of exercises, you know, where they test them and see how they do, you know, in simulations and so forth. And actually, if you look at the way most of those things work, you get studied for a week, you know, by a bunch of people. And they sit you down at the end of the week and they go, this is what you're all about, and this is how other people see you in a way that you don't see yourself.
I was wondering how you operate. So is it a situation where, you know, somebody comes to your organization and they say, you know, we'd like for you to evaluate what we're doing? Is that kind of the typical inquiry you get? Is can you take a look at what we're doing and tell us what we can improve? Is that kind of how the intake goes, or?
No, not really, because now in my old world it did, because we were so specialized in an industry, we get those kinds of inquiries, but I don't think we get many inquiries like that. Most of the inquiries we get are usually about a thing, we're having problems with X. Do you guys do anything that will help X? Is that a fair
That's a
statement?
very fair statement. Yeah.
And because what I'm picturing is kind of like the Bob's in Office Space, where you're sitting around and going and interviewing everybody,
Right.
but so well that's interesting then. So if people have a specific question then, so if they're coming in, is it a challenge that they face in their industry, or is it more of a, hey, we've got a culture problem, or how do we go dealing with succession, or I guess it could be a mix of those types of things.
It could be, and we had a call the other day that they just flat out told us, one of the biggest agenda items that we have in 2021 is to redo our strategic planning, and we're looking for somebody to help with that. So occasionally, they just tell you. I think a lot of times, I just like talking to people and listening to business owners. And I feel most alive in that, when I'm listening to somebody talk about their business. So a lot of times we just kind of sit and listen, and then, you give them some input, and then if there's something you can help with, it'll eventually kind of crystallize.
So when you talk about strategic planning for a business, what type of kind of, be it documents or thought processes or things, do you think it's important to develop and to continually update? Because do you need a vision statement? Do you need a core value statement? Do you need a business plan? Or what do you think a business owner needs to have to really kind of have an organized vision for the future, or strategic vision?
That's a great question. There are, classically certain, building blocks of that come out of the, the management books, and everybody kind of knows the, vision and mission and values and culture and goals and objectives and strategies and tactics. Those are your typical, strategy war words. But I would say that, I've always felt like, and I did a lot of strategy in my life with some companies that were small to very large, but they were never the huge ones like the McKinseys of the world, So we had a more of a brass tacks, I guess, view of all this. But I think a founder of a going concern who does well, and the proof is in the numbers, right? And so I think anybody that's got that going on, there's a strategy there. Now they may not have written it down, right? Especially the founders, the patriarchs, the entrepreneurs who are, on the early side of the life cycle curve. They probably wouldn't even fathom writing it down. But as the business gets more mature, you got more people running around, I think that's where the strategic plan, having a little structure, can start to help, and to put those building blocks in place. And a lot of it, honestly, it's a framework for being able to go to your people and to some outside, constituents as well. But I think mostly for your people, and to say, this is where we're trying to go. And to message that over and over and over again. And I used to joke, Will's heard me, talk to many times, but I used to give presentations when I was the head of my old firm about our strategy, maybe 100 people sitting there, and as soon as I was done, somebody would come up and say, you really should do some strategic planning. Like they didn't hear, So employees don't get the message very easily. And the first few times they get it, they're too busy, too disinterested, too distracted. It doesn't get through, and you really have to hammer on it over and over and over. So I think the framework provides that, and the implementation of it is really hard, because they've already got day jobs. So it gives you a framework to keep coming back and say, we said our goal was, whatever. You could apply this to your personal life. How many people set goals at the beginning of a year, and then by the end of February, they forgot they set them, right?
And that makes sense. So it's kind of the way I'm hearing what you're saying is that sometimes these things, it can almost be a form over substance situation where you're like, all right, I've developed my mission statement, or I've got our core values, or we've got this. But if you're really not making progress toward, or if your actions aren't geared towards accomplishing the end goal, then it's kind of it's just empty rhetoric almost.
Yeah, or just makes you feel good that you have a plan written down or whatever. But it's a blend of the two. I do think that for an organization that gets some size and critical mass, and you've got some people to influence, it can do a lot of good. And it can give you a framework for following through on your agenda. You know, most CEOs that I know, you know, especially if you got a new CEO coming in, he's got a strategic agenda. You know, and there's stuff he's charged with making happen, or he's charged himself with making happen. And so he's going to have to, you know, show that he can get things done. And it's a potential framework for that.
You know, often I think implementation can be the most difficult issue. Because, you know, and Will, I'm sure you've seen it, but like especially in the legal business, for example, you know, lawyers are good at figuring out why something won't work or why something's not a good idea. So it seems like you'll have, at least in a legal meeting or a meeting, you'll sit there and spin around in circles for an hour, and you might come up with a bunch of good ideas, but then the whole thing's why this won't work, or this gets shot down, or that shot down. But then sometimes you might get ideas, but the resistance comes in implementation, where it's like, all right, now we figured it out, we've got our system, or we've got our value, or we've got our goal. Now we're going to make steps towards implementation. And when you're facing resistance in that, what do you think are kind of, what do you think are successful strategies for trying to overcome implementation obstacles, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. We used to have this old saying about, you know, why doesn't somebody do something? And it usually was three things. You know, they either they don't know how, you know, or they don't have enough time, or they feel like they somehow lack support. And I'm sure there are other reasons, but those are three fairly big ones, you know. So one thing to do is to try to think about what does this look like from the employee's perspective? Why aren't they moving? You know, if there's some, you know, examination of that, and you sit back and say, well, you know, maybe I put the wrong task with the wrong person. Maybe I didn't give them enough time. Maybe it's not realistic, you know, for whatever reason. So I think plans are kind of there to be like kind of a yardstick, and it's going to be very, very natural and very organic that a lot of times you're going to measure what you've done and say, well, we fell short, but at least we know it, you know, and now that we know it, we take some actions to redress it.
Well, kind of leading into the accountability concepts, and this might be kind of in your realm a little bit, Will, as far as the HR standpoint. From what I've observed, there's kind of a trend away from performance evaluations. And I don't know, or at least changing how they're done. You know, I've seen it in organizations where it used to be, you know, how's this person doing on a scale of 1 to 10, and there'd be a numeric score assigned, or there's also, and I forgot, you might know the term for it, but the tendency to grade someone below, or to give like if it's a 4 or 5, you know, if they have to get a certain score to advance or get a promotion or raise, to kind of the tendency to take issue with the, you know, assign a 3 or a 4 out of 5 in order to avoid the compulsory raise where that happens, and that ends up being a source of consternation, where sometimes the reason for raise might be just the money's not there in the company, but instead they have to kind of manipulate the performance evaluations. Is that something that you're seeing as far as kind of altering the way evaluations are done?
The biggest issue I see is that folks still don't do them at all, or if they do them, they do them haphazardly or irregularly, or the detail at which they approach them is just not sufficient. And so, you know, from my perspective, one thing we can do is train managers on how to appropriately evaluate their employees given the culture of the company, develop good evaluation instruments. There are others out there in the marketplace, but you need something that's a standard that you can follow. And in terms of the numerical grade, I mean, we've used that before, but there's got to be some subjective commentary along with it, and a chance for the employee to comment how, you know, in regard to how they feel, you know, their own self-evaluation. If you're not doing that, it's just one side of the conversation.
Do you think it's preferable to have a haphazard evaluation process or none at all?
6 half dozen or the other. I mean, if you do it haphazardly, and this is Will as an employment attorney talking, if you do it haphazardly, you're not doing yourself any favors if you end up eventually having to take disciplinary action, and the employee evidence a reason for why they believe they've been treated unfairly. Meanwhile, if you don't do it at all, you're not doing the business any favors, because you're not developing your talent and you're not moving folks up and out.
Well, and so when I'm talking about performance evaluation, I mean, I guess every day can really be an evaluation when, if the management person's engaged and active, and the individual might be observing the employee and kind of doing an internal evaluation rather than reducing it to a writing or having a meeting. But I mean, I guess the more of what I was asking is, do you think that there's a benefit to at least doing some kind of a reduction to writing or meeting, where it might be kind of haphazard? Maybe it's once every, you're not doing it on the year every year. You're doing it maybe when something good happens, or it's 18 months, or it's sporadic. Do you think that can cause more harm than not doing it at all?
It's probably better to do something than nothing. I mean, if you put a gun to my head, it's probably better to do something than nothing. But just understand that if you're not sharing those documents with the employee, it's like it didn't happen.
Yep. Understood. One of the things I think that's interesting from a business concept is when I was in school and kind of just starting out, I thought it was kind of nerdy maybe to read business strategy books, and I was like, I don't, who's got time for that, and but now I'm kind of into it, and some of the books that you see that are out there, they can be extremely helpful. And they even help me, kind of in the legal world from a negotiation standpoint, or that sort of thing. Do you have any books that you're reading that you would recommend to anybody out there?
I switched my reading habits away from a lot of that because it was that was my stock and trade for much of my career. When I was young, I read every one of them, and it gave me something to do on an airplane, and I still got libraries full of them. But I made the decision that I had enough of that, and so I rarely read a management book anymore. It would have to be something foisted on me. Yeah. But I would say that I do read some things. I just read a biography, I guess you'd say it's biography by Stephen Schwartzman, who is the guy that founded Blackstone Capital, and I found that great. I mean, so I like to read about real people accomplishing real things, or I really like history of great people. So I've kind of switched to that kind of a track.
Well, I certainly know what you mean about your leisure time, not wanting to get involved with your work, or if you're doing business and business consulting, you don't want to read about it when you get done. I've got family members that'll call me up sometimes, but hey, guess what? There's a new legal show on. You ought to check it out. It's, oh yeah, I'll jump right on that. That's just what I'd like to see when I get home is a bunch of actor lawyers arguing with each other, or making their cases on TV. But
listen, I'm going to date myself here, especially these two who weren't born when I probably would talk about this. But the business book is a funny thing if you're old enough to have perspective on it. But there literally weren't many of them. I mean, if you went back pre-1980, that was a rare thing. I mean, there were a few. There were some classic things. Peter Drucker used to write the occasional management tome, but it was the whole library of business books on the market wouldn't fill this table. I mean. And so 1980, there was a book, it was really, the biggest one was Tom Peters did a book called In Search of Excellence. Came out in about, like 81 or 82. And then there was a book called Megatrends, roughly in the same era, by a guy named John Nesbitt. And so those two books started this just movement of creation of these books. And all these years later, I regard most of them as works of fiction in terms of what they're all about. But
yeah, and I'm a little bit late to the dance on some of that stuff, but I do enjoy him a little bit. Now, you mentioned Peter Drucker. He was the Harvard professor, wasn't he? He
was. I can't remember if he was Harvard or not. But he was. Peter Drucker was the guy back in the 50s who first came out with the idea of management by objectives, which really was what started objectives at the strategy level, and then objectives in an ideal world that went down to your performance of reviews of people, right? And so everything was supposed to be tied together that way. And that goes back to the 50s, and he was Drucker, if you remember his name, but he was the seminal management guru of the 20th century. And then it's hard to say who that is now. Maybe the closest guy is probably a Harvard professor named, suddenly escaping, Michael Porter. And I say that because that's my opinion, but there really is no designated successor to Drucker.
Who was the one that did the Peter Principle? That was one that I remember that people talk about all the time.
It might have been Drucker.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense if he's Peter Drucker, that he would be the one. But that's one that kind of you see kicked around a lot.
Yeah, that's an old one. But the funny thing about those books is they proliferated in the 80s, and really by somewhere in the 90s they had reached this, status where really you would just write something that basically the idea could be put down in 2 pages, and the rest of the book, which would go on for 350 pages, was about how it worked at GE and Procter and Gamble, and so they just became awful, I thought. Now a lot of people like Jim Collins. He's probably the most
good to great.
He's probably the most popular, managerial writer of the day, because he's got a knack for being able to say pretty common sense things in a way that the population grabs it, and so his sayings are widely dispersed in the world of management.
Yeah, and a lot of it does. It's some of the, I guess they're kind of memes or you see a lot of the kind of the office speak. That goes along, and I guess a lot of that gets kind of shuffled around and recycled, and
we used to get young guys out of MBA school, and all they can do is talk in acronyms and the latest buzzwords coming out of it. It's actually funny. It can make you cynical if you're not careful.
So that's interesting about about MBA. So do you have a kind of a recommendation of how long somebody should be involved in the active workforce before going to get an MBA, or to do sort of a management, or to do graduate level studies in business?
I think the business schools have it about right, because most modern day business schools, the full-time programs really won't take them unless they're out there for 2 or 3 years. So I think that's probably about right. They ought to get up, see what then you have something to relate it to, and business, without any kind of thing like. I studied business as an undergraduate and then went to graduate business school after I had some experience, but it was worlds different, because at least I had something to relate it to. I was still a young knucklehead, but I had something to relate it to. Yeah.
Do you find yourself engaged in the PR end with some of the consulting, or is that an avenue where you're gonna bring on people that specialize in that field?
We have some marketing and business development consulting capacity, and it would maybe start to bleed into PR, but we're not set up for somebody to hire us to be a PR agency, if that's the question.
I gotcha. I didn't know if some of what you're doing is kind of crisis management type situation where somebody would come in and they've got this it could be a business obstacle, it could be a specific problem where they're coming to you and they're saying, and then you look at it and say, well, the first thing you need to do is kind of develop your message or get this out to the public, if that's something that you guys are involved with.
We wouldn't be good at that in a crisis. What we can do is help somebody that needs to set up a marketing program, doesn't have one, needs to improve their business development work, and they don't have it very organized, whatever that. So we can consult on those lines, but once it gets into crisis and PR, we're probably not set up for that.
Because one of the things, and this is where I was going with this, and this is something that it might be interesting to get Will's perspective with, is I've seen law firms that get involved in PR, and they have a PR wing, or they have a PR, kind of service that they offer. And a lot of times what's best for you in a legal sense might not be best for your business. Like sometimes the best legal advice is shut up and don't do anything. But people say the business, we just can't let this go unanswered, or we need to go on the record, and we need to do this and that. And sometimes the business interest may outweigh the legal potential problem. But I was wondering if that's something that kind of how that, if that's an issue you guys grapple with, where there might be one, where you might have a legal interest that competes with the business interest, and how you guys deal with those situations.
We haven't run into that yet. We've actually there are a couple of people in Ward & Smith's department that know how to do what you're describing, but they're too busy doing what the firm needs them to do for us to go there. So we haven't gotten there yet. Maybe we will one day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's certainly not a good situation to be in when that happens. But I've always just thought it's something interesting because it's you never want to be you don't want to be the who's the lawyer with Avenatti. You don't want to do you don't necessarily get ahead of yourself like that guy may have and go on the news every night. But then sometimes there can be a time and a place for a lawyer to get out there and kind of get the client's version of the story out there.
Yeah. Well, we're not set up to be that vehicle at this point. We're purely in the consulting business.
Gotcha. Well, so I think I've got a handle on what you guys are doing, and it sounds like a really great product and a really good idea. So I hope this new venture is successful for you, and I think there's a void in the market for it. So I'm sure things are going to go great with it. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you guys want to tell everybody about what you got going on, or?
Other than the fact that we would love to help anybody that's got business issues, management issues that thinks we can be helpful. We're happy to talk to anybody, and North Carolina is our focus. We don't get outside of it. So privately held business in North Carolina is what we're all about, and we appreciate your hospitality. Thanks for
thanks for coming. I learned a lot listening to you. It brought back a bunch of, you talking about Peter Drucker, it brought back a bunch of business school memories from back in the day at the finest institution in the state of South Carolina. But I thank you again for coming on. It was a pleasure to see both of you guys and learn about what you're doing.
Much appreciated.
Thanks.